So if you don't know Dr. David Rudolph, he is, I believe, the most prolific Messianic Jewish scholar maybe in the world. I would say it. He might not, but that's probably just humility. He has 2 master's degrees. He has his PhD from Cambridge University in, I believe it was New Testament studies. He's been a congregational rabbi. He's a professor, as well as overseeing the entire Messianic Jewish Studies program. He's been married for 30 plus years to his wife, Harumi. They have two daughters? Is it 3? Okay, so we're the same. We got the three daughters. Oh, God's doing some great things. And we have so many people that will literally come from across the globe to the King's University to do the Messianic Jewish Studies program. And the reason they come is to sit under Rabbi and Dr. David Rudolph. So thank you so much for being here tonight. I just want you to know who you're in the room with. This is incredible. So what I'd love to do, we're obviously doing the Hanukkah celebration after this. We got jelly-filled donuts. So we're doing, true Hanukkah celebration, right? And I wanted you to talk a little bit about Hanukkah. I think there's probably many people in this room that understand Hanukkah. They know the story of Hanukkah, but there might be some who grew up like I did, and they're like, yeah, I know Hanukkah, Jewish Christmas. Like, what else is there to know? So will you tell us just a little bit about Hanukkah, the celebration, the story of the Maccabees, and kind of ground us in understanding from Christian standpoint, believing in Yeshua standpoint?
Okay. Well, the story of Hanukkah goes all the way back to the 2nd century BCE. And it was during a period of time when Alexander the Great had passed away, and a number of his generals, 4 of his generals actually, took over large portions of territory. And some decades later, one of those territories was the territory of Syria. And so Judea was within Syria. And there was a military leader by the name of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who basically came to Jerusalem a few times and pillaged the temple and pillaged the city. And as part of this attack on Jerusalem, he actually went into the temple and he set up an idol to Zeus. And then he sacrificed pigs to Zeus in the temple.
As like a slap in the face to the Jewish people?
Yeah. Actually, his name, Antiochus Epiphanes, the Epiphanes was actually the part of his name that he gave himself, which meant the manifest one, as in like the manifestation of Zeus. So, he was something of a megalomaniac. Yeah. But he not only set up an idol in the temple, he also took the Torah scrolls, the holy Torah scrolls, and he poured the juice of the pigs on the Torah scrolls. And then he passed laws that forbade Jewish people from living as Jews. For example, they had to eat pork. Even the high priest had to eat pork. He banned circumcision, which is a covenant sign for Jewish people. He forbid not working on the Sabbath. So in other words, Jews had to work on the Sabbath. Yeah. So he did everything he could, and with a number of these laws, they were punishable by death. And so essentially what he was trying to do was, he was trying to force the Jewish people to assimilate into Greek culture, Hellenistic culture.
Yeah. He was trying to erase Jewish identity.
Essentially.
And then tell us about the Maccabees. So the Maccabees are, kind of like the Jewish heroes of the Second Temple period time.
Right.
And was it just them kind of putting their foot down, like we're not doing this, or was it also the kind of the story of Hanukkah with the lights? Like, kind of explain that.
Yeah. So the Maccabees, they were a priestly family. They lived in a town called Modi'in, and the head of this family, the father, was named Mattathias. And one day, one of Antiochus Epiphanes' soldiers came to the town and said, he made all these wonderful comments about Mattathias and said, "You're such an important member of the Jewish community, and if you sacrifice to this idol, we will give you all these treasures, and then you will have the king's favor." And so at that moment, Mattathias said, "Of course, I would never do that. I would never abandon the covenant." And at that moment, another Jew came up and sacrificed to the idol. And when that happened, Mattathias immediately killed that Jewish man. And then, out of his kind of zeal for the Torah, and then he killed the soldier who came to the town. And in the book of First Maccabees, in chapters 1 and 2, we're told that at that point, Mattathias said, "Everyone who is zealous for the Torah, everyone who's zealous for the law, follow me." And then he went into the hill country and basically began with his sons and those who were zealous for the law who followed him. They began a kind of guerrilla war against Antiochus Epiphanes' armies. Yeah.
Which that kind of gives us some clarity in like the New Testament. We see the zealots. That is kind of a callback to we want to be like the Maccabees against Rome, rather than in this time period it was the Greeks, right?
Yeah. So this language of being zealous for the law is kind of like a technical term. Mattathias uses it when he says, "Follow me," into the countryside. But also on his deathbed, when all of his sons are surrounding him, he says to his sons, "Be zealous for the law, for the Torah." And, in saying that, what he's saying is, don't give in to these assimilationist pressures. Yeah. Even at the risk of your life, fight back. Yeah.
And then the story, when they eventually get into Jerusalem, they reclaim the temple. It's back in Jewish hands, and they want to light the menorah, which would have been in the temple from even the days of Moses, David's temple, Solomon's temple, and they don't have enough oil for it to be lit to go get more. Is that essentially the story?
Well, so the war itself took about 3 years. And I mean, just so everybody can understand, this was a kind of David and Goliath kind of situation. The Maccabees had very primitive weapons. Antiochus Epiphanes, believe it or not, had elephants. He actually had military elephants that he marched on Jerusalem with. So after 3 years, it was a miracle of miracles that they actually won this battle. When they came back to the temple, of course, they found it in disarray. They found, the idol. But beyond that, actually, the golden menorah, not just menorah, but menorahs, actually there were several at that point, had all been looted, had all been taken away, as well as the golden altar, as well as the other holy vessels that were needed in the temple in order to serve the Lord as he commanded. And so they had to actually make all of these things again. And so they began the process of reconstructing the temple, or remodeling it in a way, and kind of rededicating it on Kislev 25, again 3 years after the idol was originally put into the temple. The story about the oil is actually a much later story. It's a beautiful story that God miraculously provided the oil in order to light the menorahs. But it goes, the earliest record of it, as far as I know, is from the Talmud, which is somewhere around like the 5th century CE. So we're talking about more than 600 years after the event.
Yeah, so the actual oil story was developed over time.
Probably.
But the dedicating of the temple and the Maccabean revolt, that was much earlier.
Right. But there was a miracle.
Yeah.
The miracle was that this, ragtag band of Maccabees could defeat this huge, strong, Hellenistic Syrian military force, which is amazing.
So let's take it to the New Testament. Our, Pastor David Simon, when he was lighting the candles or praying the bread and the wine, he mentioned that there's the only reference of Hanukkah in the Bible is in the New Testament, which might, sound crazy to people, but obviously it took place after the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. It was in between what we would call the Old and New Testament, but there's a mention of it in the Gospel of John, but there's also more than just one reference to it. Is that correct?
Right. So, in John chapter 10, there's was it read? I wasn't able to hear. Okay.
Well, I think he said it, but please.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe it's worth, Bibles are good for a few things. Like, I have one of these old-fashioned Bibles,
Yeah, I was confused when I saw it. I was like, it's not an iPad. It's this strange book.
Okay, so here in John chapter 10, let's see here, verse 22, it says, "At that time, the festival of dedication took place in Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus, Yeshua, I call him Yeshua, was walking in the temple in the portico of Solomon." Now, what's interesting is it says the festival of the dedication took place in Jerusalem. So most readers of this translation, and actually most New Testament translations in English, would never actually know that the festival of dedication is Hanukkah.
Yeah, I read it for years and never, when someone said, Hanukkah's in the New Testament, I was like, no, it's not.
Yeah. Now, there are some translations, this is not one of them, this is the NRSV, but there are some translations like the NIV that in very, very small print, in a footnote, mentions that is Hanukkah. But the fact of the matter is the word Hanukkah in Hebrew means dedication. So Yeshua's in the temple, it says, during Hanukkah, and it's quite significant in that the whole story of Hanukkah revolved around the temple, because of the idol being set up. And by the way, for those who don't know, when they set up the idol, in First Maccabees, they refer to it as the abomination of desolation. So from the standpoint of the Maccabees, this was actually the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy. Now, I don't think it was the ultimate fulfillment, but from their standpoint, that's what started everything. And so Yeshua was born a little more than, about 170 years after this event. So when he was a child, it was only, around 170 years since this had happened. So you can imagine, in a way, it's within living memory. Like my great-great-great-grandfather told my great-great-grandfather, who told my grandfather, and passed along these stories. And not every Jewish person in the land of Israel or Judea was able to go to the temple on Hanukkah. Of course, Yeshua would have celebrated Hanukkah every year, but how many Jewish people in the first century could actually go to the temple on Hanukkah? So here's an example of him having that amazing experience. And what's interesting is that in John chapter 10, he talks about miracles. He talks about the miracles that I've done. And they testify about me that, I participate in the divine identity of the God of Israel. Yeah. So it's a very special chapter. But as you mentioned, there are other places in the New Testament that kind of allude to the Maccabean story. So one of those places is Acts 21. And let me just turn there. A lot of people don't see these allusions because they don't read the story of Maccabees. But if you did, you'd very quickly pick up on them. So I'll just read from verse 17. So this is Acts 21, verse 17. And it says, "When we arrived in Jerusalem, the brothers welcomed us warmly. The next day, Paul went with us to visit James, Yaakov, and all the elders were present. After greeting them, he related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. When they heard it, they praised God. Then they said to him, 'You see, brother, how many thousands of believers there are among the Jews,'" that is, these Messianic Jews, "and they are all zealous for the law." Did everyone catch that? So that's the technical term. When they said, "and they're all zealous for the law," essentially what James and the elders were saying was, we're like the Maccabees. We're really committed and
zealous to the Torah.
Zealous to the Torah and to walking in covenant faithfulness before God. Yeah. And then it actually goes on to have some other allusions. It says, "They have been told," that is, these zealous for the Torah, Messianic Jews, "they have been told about you that you, Paul, teach all the Jews living among the Gentiles, like in the diaspora, to forsake Moses." In the Greek, it's actually like apostatize from Moses. "And that you tell them not to circumcise their children or observe the customs." So what does that sound like? That sounds like the laws that Antiochus Epiphanes was passing, and that a number of Jewish apostates were teaching.
Well, and it's even brought into the modern day. I mean, how many people believe that Paul is the where the Judaism ends if you give your life to Jesus? They'll say Paul converted on the road to Damascus. He put his Judaism behind. He was a former Pharisee, former Jewish man, but he is the first Christian, and he left all the law behind and embraced grace. So it sounds like they're saying that to Paul, to his face. We've heard you've been, telling Jews not to live as Jews.
You're like an apostate, a Jewish apostate, like in the days of the Maccabees. And then it says, "and that you tell them not to circumcise their children or observe the customs. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come," that is, these zealous for the Torah Messianic Jews. "So do what we tell you." Now, this was the moment when Paul could have said, "Well, James, I am like that. That actually is what I'm teaching." But Paul didn't do that. "So what it then is to be done, they will certainly hear that you have come. So do what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Join these men, go through the rite of purification with them, and pay for the shaving of their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself observe and guard the law, the Torah." By the way, in Greek, it actually has a chi in there, which would more accurately be translated, "but you yourself also observe and guard the Torah." In other words, like these zealous for the law Messianic Jews. So, in other words, what James is trying to make sure of is that this false rumor that Paul is like one of those apostates from the Maccabean period, that this that the nail in the coffin is driven into this rumor because it's not true. Yeah. And then Paul goes into the temple. It says in verse 25, "But as for the Gentiles who have become believers, we have sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols," idols, "and from blood, and from what is strangled, and from fornication." Then Paul took the men, and the next day, having purified himself, he entered the temple with them. So here we have reference to the temple, making purification, making public the completion of the days of purification when the sacrifice would be made for each of them. So we also have in this context the temple and purification. So there are definitely a few allusions to the Maccabean story going on here.
And things that we would overread if we didn't have the Jewish context.
Exactly. That's right.
So let's bring it into modern day. Like, this is great theologically. It's great for us to understand the Jewish context.
Can I just quickly share one more passage? Because I think it's very helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, this other passage, which most people wouldn't notice, points to the Maccabean period, is in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 17 through 20. And I'll just very quickly read it. So it says, however, 1 Corinthians 7, 17 through 20, "However that may be, let each of you lead the life that the Lord has assigned, to which God called you. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised?" That is, he's Jewish at the time of the call. "Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision." Now, what is that? If someone is circumcised, Paul is saying, don't uncircumcise yourself. Well, how do you do that?
If you want to look at the slideshow we have present, no, I'm joking.
So, most people just read by that, never kind of wondering, what in the world is he talking about? Yeah. But actually, remember, I mentioned that during the Maccabean period, that Jews were banned from circumcising their sons. And there was this policy of forced assimilation. Yeah. And many Jewish young men and older men wanted to fully assimilate into the society, but the problem was that they were circumcised. And so if they were in a public setting, like a shower or the gymnasium, if they wanted to participate in sports, the gymnasium sports was in the nude. And so, believe it or not, gender surgeries were taking place in the Maccabean period. And so they actually had surgeries to put the foreskin back on. And so what Paul is alluding to here is, if you are Jewish, don't be like those Jews during the Maccabean period who assimilated and even went so far as putting the foreskin back on. Yeah. And then he says, let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. So in other words, if you're Jewish, remain Jewish. Yeah. Don't assimilate. And then he says, was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? That is, Gentile. Mm-hmm. Let him not seek circumcision. Yeah. In other words, don't convert. Yeah. And then in verse 20, he says, let each of you remain in the condition in which you were called. Yeah. In other words, if you're Jewish, don't assimilate, remain Jewish. Yeah. If you're Gentile, don't Judaize, don't take on Jewish identity. Yeah. Remain Gentile. And Paul can say that because he had this vision of the one new man, that he talks about in Ephesians 2. Yeah. And he truly believed, as he says here, that being Jewish is a calling from God, a divine calling. And he uses the term klesis, calling, here to refer to Jewish identity. And being Gentile is a calling from God. And he uses the same term. So Paul is trying to underscore here, pointing back to the Maccabean period, that God has a special plan for Jewish people, and God has a special plan for the nations as well. Yeah.
That's so good. And like we always talk about Jew-Gentile kind of in juxtaposition to male and female, that when God created male and female, brought them together in the covenant of marriage, it says they're one flesh. We all know you stay male-female.
Right.
Because God made you male-female. But there's a new unity and a calling to serve one another. And that's the same thing with Jew and Gentile. In Ephesians, he says he takes Jew and Gentile and makes them into one new man. And yet we tend to think, oh, no more Jew and Gentile.
Right.
We're all Christian now. Like, we don't need to care about that. But what we're seeing is, no, there's still Jew and Gentile. There's just new unity. And they're supposed to serve one another in their unique callings.
Right. So for Paul, the story of Hanukkah was very important because the lesson, the reminder for Jews was don't assimilate. Stay Jewish, be that covenant partner to the Gentile believers. Yeah.
Well, as we look now at the church and the Messianic movement, there's two issues relating to this. One, you will see a lot of Gentiles that think or are convinced or believe if I was Jewish, I'd be really spiritual. Like being Jewish is like being like super devout. Or they'll believe that the closest I can get to God is by getting as close to the Jewish feast or the celebrating Jewish identity, wearing marks of Jewish identity, or converting into Judaism. So there's that problem. And then the other side is you have many Jewish believers in Jesus, Yeshua, who assimilate fully into the church because they believe or were convinced it doesn't matter anymore. So you have Gentiles that desire to be Jewish because they think it's the purest form of Christianity, and you have Jewish people who want to just be Christian because they believe that it's not important anymore.
Yeah.
So what would you say to both of those groups?
Yeah. So I think that it really does go back to 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul reminds us that these are callings. And in the same way that, like you said, if we're called male and then we're not satisfied with that calling and we want to act female, become female, then in a way we're denying something that is innate to us, that God has called us to be. And we can't really fulfill God's highest plans for our lives if we try to be something that we're not. So I would say that. And I would also say that, as a Jew, as someone who really tries to live my life for the Lord, I think that the grass is always greener. Like, you can always imagine, that identity must be so much better. But in every identity has its privileges and its responsibilities, not just Jewish identity. And so there are challenges, to being Jewish. Like, for example, we live in a world today where anti-Semitism is proliferating. It's off the charts. So being Jewish is not like such a great thing right now. It's like having a target on your back, basically. So, in fact, just before coming in here, the security guard stopped me in the in the parking lot, and I was so happy that he was there because of just all the things that are going on. So being Jewish, just like being Gentile, has its calling from God.
Well, and I'm reminded of Peter's revelation in Acts 10 when Cornelius is filled with the Holy Spirit. His words are, "Now I know God shows no partiality," or in common English, God shows no favoritism. Right. So this idea that to be Jewish would be a purer form of Christianity. It goes against the revelation of the Holy Spirit.
Absolutely.
But now let's talk about Jewish identity, because this is a confusing one. And I know we don't have a lot of time, and I don't want the jelly donuts to get cold. But what is Jewish identity? And I know there's a lot of confusion, but I know there's also different opinions, right? Because you have the religion, you have the kind of nationality, you have people born in Israel, you have people born outside of Israel, or you might have someone who found out they were Jewish. Mm-hmm. So what does it mean to be Jewish? Because you have the bloodline, essentially, the ancestry, mm-hmm. but you also have people that can convert into it. So it gets very messy and confusing. Yeah. So first, just help us define, what is Jewish identity? What does it really mean? Because if you're Jewish, embrace your Jewish identity. Yeah. What does that mean? Just Hanukkah rather than Christmas? Is that what we do? Or, wear a kippah? Like, what does that really mean?
So it is complex. There are, covenantal and calling and historical and biblical factors, all intertwined. But it can actually be kind of simplified. There is some basic understanding of what Jewish identity entails, so that you can determine who is a Jew and who's not a Jew. Yeah. So I put together an acronym to help remind me, which the acronym is JCC. JCC. So the first thing is that most Jewish people have Jewish parents. That's the J. Okay? So in Orthodox Jewish halakha, or the application of Jewish law, that would mean that you have a Jewish mother. Mm-hmm. Okay? If you're part of the Reformed Jewish community, and there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, I don't know the exact number of Reformed Jews, but it's quite large in the United States. Mm-hmm. In Reformed Judaism, if your mother is Jewish, or your father is Jewish, and if your father is Jewish, you publicly identify as a Jew through rites of passage, then you are considered a Jew. Mm-hmm. In the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, if your father is a Jew, you're a Jew. Yeah. In the New Testament, if your father is a Jew, you're a Jew. But also there's a precedent: if your mother is a Jew, you're a Jew. Mm-hmm. So as you can see, there is some difference of opinion, but generally having one Jewish parent, being a Jew, one Jewish parent, is enough to satisfy at least one stream within Judaism. Yeah. Okay, so that's one aspect of Jewish identity. Secondly, there's the C, the second C. The second C is covenant, the sign of the covenant. So Jewish identity is not just genealogical, it's covenantal. Mm-hmm. So circumcision is the sign of the covenant. Mm-hmm. And so there's this understanding from Genesis 17 that if you are in the covenant that God made with Abraham, then you must circumcise your son, and then your son must circumcise his son, and his son must circumcise his son, so that there's a continuing chain of Jewish identity that gets passed down from generation to generation to generation. And actually in Genesis 17, it says, and I'll read this to you because, again, a lot of people don't read this, and I think it's quite important. And since I do have one of these paper Bibles in front of me, I just want to show that it really...
But I'm fast on my iPad. Pop, 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 pop.
It really does work. Okay, here we go. It says here in Genesis 17, God said to Abraham, "As for you, you shall keep my covenant and your offspring after you throughout their generations." So that's the chain of Jewish identity. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. Throughout your generations, every male among you shall be circumcised when he is 8 days old, including the slave born in your house, and the one bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring. Both the slave born in your house and the one bought with your money must be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. So you see, what I think is significant about that text is it shows you can leave Jewish identity. So you can assimilate to the point that if a Jewish father doesn't circumcise his son, then the next generation is actually cut off from the Jewish people and cut off from the covenant. So it is possible to lose Jewish identity. But it is an essential part, the passing on of the covenant and the sign of the covenant in particular is an essential part of Jewish identity. So you've got the J, the Jewish parents, you've got the C, the covenant, circumcision, and then the last C is conversion. So throughout history, there have always been Gentiles who have come into the Jewish people. Typically, that is because of intermarriage. Yeah. So Jewish people marrying non-Jewish people, and then they want their children to be Jewish. And so conversion, which essentially is a formal process, a formal ceremony done under the auspices of a rabbi. Yeah. If male, it involves being circumcised and certain blessings over that taking place. And so essentially what you have then is a Jewish person who does not have Jewish parents, but nonetheless, they are regarded as being Ben Avraham, as being a son of Abraham or a daughter of Sarah, by virtue of the choice they have made. The best analogy I can give, because for some people it doesn't quite make sense, so how can you do that? Think of a U.S. citizenship. There are two ways you can be a U.S. citizen. One way, which is the way my wife Harimi and I did it, is we had children, and then they became U.S. citizens. Yeah. Actually, my wife is from Japan, and she's a Japanese citizen, so actually they also became Japanese citizens that way. But there's another way to become a U.S. citizen, and that is through naturalization. So you go through a formal process, a ceremony, and that concludes with an oath that you take. Yeah. And then that individual, by choice, has become an American citizen. Yeah. So very similar. Yeah. So...
That's so good. That's helpful for us to know and understand at the church. But there's also this idea of reclaiming Jewish identity, right? I don't know if we have time to go into that whole can of worms, but I think part of the return to Israel, returning back to the Jewish nation, there are also people that realize that they are Jewish, or that like Pastor Mateos shared with us, in the Inquisition, they were forced conversions. So there's also this reclaiming of Jewish identity, which is part of, I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah. Well, just very briefly, I'll mention some thoughts on that. So first of all, you have this Genesis 17 passage that if you don't circumcise your sons, then you've cut them off from the covenant. Yeah. But that's in tension with the fact that later on, there is a generation of people that are connected to the Jewish people in some way. And so we do see that with crypto-Jews, with Anusim, with certain communities where there's been a great deal of assimilation.
Yeah.
The way in which Orthodox Judaism has handled that is by developing a category, a halachic category, a category of Jewish law, the application of Jewish law, which is referred to as Zera Yisrael, which means in Hebrew, seed of Israel. And so it's recognized that like people who had to hide their Jewish identity for generations, or like the Ethiopian Jews who, they were faithful as the best that they could be, in passing on their Jewish identity, that they continue to have some relationship to the Jewish people. They're Zera Yisrael. But at the same time, Orthodox Judaism does not recognize them as Jews. If they want to become Jews, like full halachic Jewish members of the Jewish community, then the average Orthodox rabbi would say you need to go through a conversion. Either a full conversion, or there's kind of like a more expedited form.
To reclaim.
Gior lechama, or something like that. But both of them are forms of conversion. And so what we run into with Gentile believers is this. First, Paul's rule. Paul said, if you're uncircumcised, remain uncircumcised. Don't become uncircumcised. Are there exceptions to the rule? I think so, because Paul circumcised Timothy. Timothy's mother was Jewish, but his father was Greek. And Paul felt the need to kind of bring Timothy out of this place of doubtful Jewish identity. And so he circumcised him. But generally speaking, the rule is, according to Paul, which is, I would call this halakha, I would call this New Testament halakha. If you are uncircumcised, remain uncircumcised. If you're a Gentile, remain Gentile. Do not seek to become Jewish. Do not convert. And again, I think the reason for that is because Paul had such a high view of Gentile identity, of the nations, and the importance of people identifying as Gentiles, as members of the nations, as people of God. The other factor that needs to be considered is that if someone wanted to undergo a conversion as a Gentile believer, the average Orthodox rabbi, conservative rabbi, or Reform rabbi would require them to renounce their belief in Yeshua. And so I would not encourage a Gentile believer to go that route for that reason. In cases of intermarriage, where you're marrying a Gentile person and you want to make sure that your children are Jewish, I think a case can be made for exceptions to the rule. But even then, I would encourage going through a Messianic Jewish rabbinical authority rather than through an Orthodox Jewish rabbi. Not in any way to diminish the authority of the Orthodox rabbi, but just, I don't think we should ever go to an authority that would ask us to in any way lower who Yeshua is in our lives.
That's so good. Well, thank you for sharing with us tonight.
You're welcome.
I think we all got 3 credit hours at the King's University, right? We're going to make sure to get that to you. Some of you might be thinking, this is amazing. You're intellectual by nature, scholarly. Some of you are thinking, what does this really mean for me? Why are we spending time talking about this? Majority of us are probably Gentile, like myself. But as we were praying earlier before the service, and we asked Pastor Austin, who led us in worship, wasn't worship amazing with Pastor Austin and Emmanuel from Israel? I just asked him to share the heart for the worship portion, so we can all pray together. And Austin shared that what he felt the Holy Spirit was sharing with him was the scripture that the Lord gave Pastor Austin was on Jesus talking about not being lukewarm. And so all of the songs that we declared in worship were declaring Yeshua is Lord. And the interesting thing as we were praying is, I told him, this is a Hanukkah service. Hanukkah is about these Maccabeans who were so passionate about their God-given identity and not to assimilate, which is essentially to be lukewarm. And so I think the call for all of us in our Jewish and Gentile identity to not be lukewarm and not to think that one is better than the other, but to serve one another, to understand our identity and serve the other. But then also with our faith in Yeshua, to be zealous for the Torah, zealous for the Hebrew Bible, zealous for the New Testament, zealous for what Yeshua, Jesus, has called us to do and how he's called us to live. So I want to be described as zealous for the Bible, zealous for God. Anyone else? So will you stand with me? Can we give Dr. David Rudolph one more round of applause for coming and being with us?